Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Horus Heresy lore roundups. We are still on book 4, and this is part 2. Things start to move very quickly here, so we're going to go over a lot somewhat quickly right here at the beginning. Nathaniel Garro has been sent over to the light frigate, the Eisenstein, where he is supposed to stay in orbit while everybody else goes down to play on the planet of Istvan. Along with him comes his fellow captain Grulgor, who has been sent specifically by Typhon, apparently against Mortadian's will, or possibly just without his knowing, to make sure that when the time comes, Nathaniel makes the correct choice. Now, we've already talked about the events that were going on down on Istvan and Saul Tarvet's flight from the Emperor's Children, so we shan't reiterate that too much here. Instead, we'll get to what happened on the Eisenstein. Now, as mentioned, Nathaniel Garro had himself a housecarl, a servant of sorts by the name of Caleb. He was the same guy that had read prayers of Nathaniel Garro when he was incapacitated after the battle on Istvan Extremis. He was also a curious little bastard, and he had noticed something that nobody else had, as he had been ordered by Nathaniel to stay behind as everyone else went up to the bridge of their new ship, and oversee the unloading process. He had noticed that one of the packages had been dropped, and that Grulgor had gotten very antsy when that had happened. This had made Caleb very suspicious, and decided to follow Grulgor and these seemingly very important packages. What he discovered was that Grulgor was loading virus bombs onto the Eisenstein's weapon systems, in preparations for bombarding the planet below. Caleb was very nearly caught, because a human sneaking from Astartes tends to be difficult, but he was saved by Nathaniel Garro's personal apothecary, his first company squad apothecary, who had, by the way, been in some hot waters. It had become apparent that he was a member of the Lodge, the organization that Garro was not particularly fond of. And while Garro did not care what his company members did, he did care what the members of his own command squad did, since they could be seen within the internal hierarchy of the Death Guard to be representative of Garro, and indeed they had been. Earlier on in the books, Grulgor had noted that it was very hypocritical of Nathaniel to keep this apothecary in his command squad, assuming that he knew about his connection to the Lodge, and yet openly condemn that very same Lodge. As also previously mentioned, the Death Guard was surprisingly political within its internal hierarchy. Now, the other legions, of course, also had political schemes, jostling for position, etc., but very few had anything even close to this degree of internal politicking. In fact, the only one I can really think of would be the Word Bearers, and in that case it was for very different reasons. Or, well, that could be debated. Anyways, moving on. The message was taken to Nathaniel, which he was kind of, well, this is unusual. Why the hell is he loading virus bombs? I have not received any orders to this nature, no permissions have come down from the upper management, and only the War Master could authorize the usage of these weapons. And of course it was Grulgor. Now, Nathaniel and Grulgor were not exactly best buddies, so that didn't exactly help either. He chose to take his command squad, fully armed and armored, down to the armament decks and confront Grulgor, which ended, predictably enough, with a good old-fashioned firefight, which ended rather abruptly with one shell striking one of the glass containers of virus bombs. Now, precisely why the ludicrously lethal virus was stored in glass containers, I couldn't answer that question. For reasons of plot drama, I would assume, because the virus eats through glass quite happily. Granted, there is a mention of a special membrane inside that prevents that from happening, but in that case, why would you not apply said membrane to something along the lines of a, oh, I don't know, 20mm thick steel sphere or something? You know, to avoid this precise problem? It just seems a little risque to me, but oh well, details. What has happened, happened, and now everybody had to get the fuck out of the room nice and quick. Now, it was only a hairline fracture. If the shell had actually been burst open, everyone in the room would be dead and probably everyone aboard the ship. But since the virus needed a little bit of a moment to get some grip on the glass and actually start flooding out onto the room, there was a moment, a minuscule moment, where they actually could escape, and most of them did, but only due to Caleb sacrificing himself. The lowly housecarl saved Nathaniel Garro, the ship, and you might even go so far as to say the Imperium in the long term, by hitting the emergency releases on the blast doors, separating the bombardier deck from the rest of the ship, saving it all from contagion. Nathaniel Garro subsequently gave the order for the entire bombardier's deck to be vented into the void to ensure that no trace of the virus would remain. Furthermore, he also ordered that Grulgor's remaining command staff should be found, arrested if possible, and killed if not. As far as Nathaniel Garro knew, he was one of the first Astartes officers to have ever ordered that very thing, to find and kill fellow Astartes. Of course, he could not know of the wider conspiracy and the fact that this had happened a few times already, but the act clearly weighed very heavily upon Nathaniel and his command crew, who started to question whether or not they were doing the right thing. They knew what Grulgor had done, but they simply couldn't make themselves believe that this was somehow part of a larger plot. It was easier for them to think that Grulgor had somehow gone insane, acted on his own, fallen to some kind of mind trickery, anything but face the reality that the Legion they all had sworn fealty to was turning against its own. In fact, a few even blamed Nathaniel for all of this and viewed this as an outright act of rebellion at this point, though none acted on that just yet. Now, this is where something else rather interesting happened. Nathaniel went down to Caleb's cell, where he kept his personal possessions, and discovered a small brass shell casing coming from a bolt gun with an Imperial Aquila inscribed upon it. He also found Caleb's version of the Lectitio Divinatus. All of this, plus 100 other words and deeds, made it quite obvious that Caleb was, and had for a very long time, been a member of the Imperial Faith. Something else that Nathaniel had taken a strong stance against. Nathaniel, as previously mentioned, was a straight up-and-down soldier. He did not like any form of secrecy, be it warrior lodges or secret religious cults, and yet now, with everything he knew, everything he rested his head upon, everything he based his convictions upon, crumbling beneath him, his legion, his Primarch, his battle brothers, all of his understanding of reality was now just crumbling away, and so, like so many others, he felt the lure of the absolute truth of religion. And as so many who had had everything they believed in taken away from them, he fell to his knees and prayed as best he knew, asking the Emperor to give him faith and to give him certainty. And that was precisely what happened. Garro felt as if something within him had suddenly broken free. He was met with a sudden rush of strength and vigor and determination, and in his vision he saw a small, frail, elfin-looking woman who asked him to save her. Shortly thereafter, a certain lunar wolf came flying towards the Eisenstein, asking for their protection. Aboard that ship was, of course, Euphrati Keeler. This is what I like about this whole is she a saint or is she simply a psyche debate, because some of these things, like this one, could probably be explained fairly easily with good old-fashioned psychic powers. But then again, there's also the other stuff, like telling a demon to fuck off by waving a small Aquila at it. That is most definitively not a usual psychic power. It keeps the reader a little bit on the edge, a little bit confused. It keeps him guessing, which is exactly what they're supposed to do. Personally, I actually do think she's the first saint. How precisely that came about, considering that would either require A, the Emperor to have power within the warp to create saints, or possibly simply just being such a ridiculously powerful psychic that he can work through others and give them a small inkling of his psychic potential, possible, or that the Chaos God, known as the Emperor, was even now starting to actually come into existence, which would be a rather interesting theory. I personally do believe that the Chaos God known as the Emperor is almost certainly an entity in 40k, where he's worshipped by billions, but this suggestion that he might have existed already as early as in 30k, that is a very interesting idea. And of course, it's not like the concept of a God Emperor was entirely new in 30k either. After all, Lorgar and his boys had been building entire cities dedicated to the worship of God Emperor for quite some time, despite the fact that Big E himself had told them to stop doing that on numerous occasions. It would be truly hilarious, wouldn't it, if Lorgar was the one responsible for giving the Emperor the power he needed to eventually thwart Horus's plans. Oh, Lorgar, you just can't stop fucking up, can you? So, time for a little summary. At this point, Nathaniel Garro had talked to Saul Tarvitz, who was now on the planet Istvan, and he had received the ship containing Euphrati Keeler and the half-herd. At this point in time, it was getting fairly obvious that something very bad was about to happen, and that Garro was going to have to break with his legion. He also received that bit of inspiration, of course, from the God Emperor, or at the very least we'll assume it was him, because, well, that makes it more convincing. He did, however, have somebody else he needed to convince, namely the crew on the frigate Eisenstein. Convincing them about the fact that they were about to be betrayed was relatively easy, because they had a hold full of virus bombs, and space marines shooting at each other in the halls of the ship. That was a pretty good argument. Certain elements inside Garro's command squad were still not entirely convinced, but they were still willing to go along with this for the time being. And so a plan was made. The Eisenstein would try to flee from Istvan, hoping to get out of system before the majority of the now Traitor fleet could notice what they were doing and blast them into smithereens. After all, one small frigate was not going to be doing much of anything to this entire fleet. The plan was audacious, because again, they were a relatively small craft, not a particularly powerful craft, neither in engines nor weapons nor shields. So they needed a relatively clear route. And the only such route that existed would bring them right past the Terminus Est, the flagship of the Death Guard's first company captain, Typhon. And the odds that he was going to be letting them pass unmolested were exceedingly tiny. But in the immortal words of Hero Commissar Cyphers Kane, if your only chance at survival is charging a Carnifex whilst only armed with a broken chair leg, you charge the Carnifex. But before we get into what exactly happened, we need to talk a little bit about Typhon himself, because the book shows us a few revelations. Previously on, I found it a bit odd that he would be so circumspect, that he would apparently be willing to disobey, or at the very least, creatively interpret the orders from his Primarch. Turns out, Typhon had gotten a hell of a lot longer down the road of corruption than I gave him credit for. At this point, Typhon had already been initiated in some of the deeper and darker rituals of chaos by Erebus, which he refers to as one of his comrades. In fact, he's positively frustrated that he even has to continue taking orders from Mortarion at all, as he is of the opinion that his knowledge has far outstripped his master. The sheer hubris involved in even thinking that very thought should tell you everything you need to know about the moral decline of the Death Guard. And it didn't stop at mere good old-fashioned insubordination, oh no. Typhon had plans to break away from the Death Guard. His wording seems to state quite emphatically that he wished to literally break away from the Death Guard and start his own mini warband, I assume. This is probably the first mention anywhere of a captain or high commander wishing to entirely leave their parent legion or organization and strike out on their own. It would appear that in some cases the Death Guard were even more split than the Word Bearers, which is downright impressive, if you ask me. However, Typhon was not a complete idiot, and he was starting to wonder what had happened to Grulgor. The bombardment against Isstvan was now complete, and he was wondering why he hadn't been contacted yet, because surely Nathaniel Garro would not have allowed the bombardment to proceed. And in that case, Grulgor was to kill Nathaniel, and Grulgor was not the kind of person to stay quiet about his victories. And so, not having received any kind of communication was very odd. He ordered one of the deck crewmen to go and see if there had been any word from the Eisenstein, and there had. There were 2 messages. One stating that they had troubles with their battery decks and were unable to partake in the bombardment. The second stated that the trouble on the battery deck had spread to the enginarum, and that they were currently having problems maintaining engine power and their position within the lines. This second message also came with Grulgor's own ID attached to it. They also had a response from the War Master's fleet stating that they should pull out of low orbit and try to fix their engine troubles. When Typhon asked where the ship was now, it was pulling out of formation and leaving bombardment range, slowly but surely pulling further away from the fleet, which was not unusual in and of itself. If a ship has severe engine troubles, it will pull out of formation with the other ships, just in case it suffers a catastrophic malfunction, which might result in pieces of the ship flying in very many directions at very high speed. It was, in other words, a plausible excuse, and whilst Typhon had certainly expected to hear from Grulgor after he'd finished off Garro, Grulgor not exactly being known to be the most humble of souls, that in and of itself was not really enough of a reason for him to become suspicious. Now, this is a little bit odd to me. So Typhon is entirely convinced that Garro would not fall in line. In fact, he specifically broke with his Primax orders because he was entirely sure that Grulgor would have to kill Garro. And yet, despite the ship, Garro and Grulgor being placed on suffering engine troubles, and not partaking in the bombardment, and not receiving any word that Garro was dead, he decides to give them the benefit of the doubt. Huh. That really doesn't sound like the Typhon I know, but then again, perhaps this was Typhon in his younger days, when he was but a little bit naive. Fucking unlikely. Good old-fashioned plot convenience seems more likely, but oh well, minor details. So Typhon apparently just kind of let this go and decided to not bother with it, until he received a third message, this also coming from the Eisenstein, with no cryptation attached. This was being sent from the Chief Communications Officer of the Eisenstein, and said Chief Communication Officer said that the ship had been taken over by a renegade Astartes who were planning to flee the battle. Well now, that is something that Typhon can't ignore. And now let's have a quick little segue, because why did this happen? Well, Garro decided to tell the command personnel of the ship what he was intending to do, including of course his command squad. And pretty much all of them were more or less on board. The ship personnel were all on board, having been rather horrified at the idea that they were about to virus bomb loyalists, but some of his command squad was still not completely on board, clinging desperately to the idea that this must somehow be some form of mistake, some form of miscommunication. And a couple apparently even harbored ideas that perhaps Mortarion and the Primarchs were in the right on this. The crew of the Eisenstein, however, was not informed of this. However, one communications officer by the name of Mars, well, he obviously heard enough to figure out what was going on, and he decided to take matters into his own hands, sending a communique to Typhus. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised that Garro would let anybody he didn't know 100% was on board to get within 1,000,000 miles of a communications device, but then again, Garro did have a few other things on his mind at the moment, so perhaps he simply didn't think about it, which was going to turn out to be a little bit of a problem. When the Terminus Est heaved to and began pursuing the Eisenstein, it became rather obvious to Garro that somebody had talked, and the only one who could have would be the communications officer, which he promptly hauled out of his communications booth and briefly interrogated, to which the officer responded that his oath is to the fleet and the War Master. And Garro's retort to all of this was to simply snap the communications officer's neck. And this happened just as a nice big fat lance beam from the Terminus Est flew right across the Eisenstein's bow. And very helpfully, the deck crew of the Eisenstein suggested that this might be some sort of hint from the captain of the Terminus Est that the Eisenstein should heave to. Garro, on the other hand, decided to ignore this particular request and ordered the bridge crew to make all possible speed the fuck away from the giant battleship that was currently trying to obliterate them. Subterfuge was clearly no longer going to work, and good old-fashioned engine power was now going to have to save the Eisenstein, Garro, and the warning for the Emperor. Luckily for them, Subterfuge had already bought them a fair bit of a head start on the Terminus Est. This meant that the Eisenstein was at the extreme range of the Terminus's guns. And this was very, very lucky indeed, because generally speaking, a light cruiser is less than a gnat to a battleship. A single lance volley would usually be more than enough to turn said light cruiser into a gently spinning cloud of debris. But at the extreme end range of the Terminus Est lance batteries, it could not simply obliterate the Eisenstein in a single blow. But that in no way means that the Terminus couldn't hurt the Eisenstein. One glancing blow to the Eisenstein's rear quarters knocked out several decks and caused heavy damage to the ship's small astropathic choir, which was going to be a rather large problem a bit later down the line. Back on the Terminus Est, Typhon, and I might have been calling him Typhus too, by the way, sorry for that, I keep confusing the name, so I'll actually explain why. Typhus is his name now as the Herald of Nurgle, while Typhon was the name he was using at this period of time, so if you hear me talking about Typhus, I'm actually talking about Typhon. It's just, the two names get mixed up in my head occasionally. Anyways, back to the story. Typhon had called Malaghurst to inform him that there might be a teensy-weensy little problem currently burning towards the outer edges of the system on a certain light cruiser. Malaghurst was not particularly fond to be drawn away from his business with Istvan, and even less pleased to be drawn away because he was about to be told that his War Master's plans were about to be revealed to everyone. And considering the fact that there was no love lost between the Sons of Horus and the Death Guard, the exchange was rather terse. Additionally, and quite interestingly, Malaghurst offered absolutely no form of assistance whatsoever to Typhon. He merely stated that Typhon had best do his damnedest to end the Eisenstein before it escaped the system. Now, certainly, none of the Sons of Horus' ships were within intercept range, or even weapons range, in all due likelihood, of the Eisenstein. However, the fleet would have with it several carriers, and considering the distance the Eisenstein would still have to travel to get to a stable jump point, one would think that a squadron of bombers would have been launched at the ship. Even if they couldn't catch it, at the very least they might hope that Typhus could score a lucky hit on the ship's engine, and then the bombers might be able to catch up and destroy it. You'd think that all they'd have to lose was a little bit of fuel, but no such efforts were made, which is rather interesting. Now, of course, this could simply just be an oversight on the part of the writer, but I think it more interesting to see this as friction already starting to appear between the various traitor legions. Especially as Malaghost made sure to make a point out of the fact that after Horus had yelled at him, Malaghost would make damn sure that the War Master knew who to blame for letting the Eisenstein slip out of their grasp in the first place. And speaking of the Eisenstein, it was currently making all due speed for the nearest stable warp point. This, however, meant that it had to take a somewhat creative path. Especially considering the fact that the Terminus Est was currently doing everything within its considerable power to turn the Eisenstein into a nice little cloud of space dust. The plan was to head towards one of the nearby moons of the Istvan system and use its gravitational pull to slingshot the light cruiser around the moon, and thereby giving it a substantial speed boost over the much larger, heavier, and less maneuverable Terminus Est, which in all due likelihood could not complete the maneuver without literally face-palming into the moon itself. The maneuver was dodgy and difficult, to put it lightly, and the calculations were made by hand by one of the naval officers, a woman, by the way, by the name of Watt. Just in case any Fem40k people are watching and wish to bring up the idea that females never do anything important in 40k. And luckily for everyone involved, the female in question knew her spatial calculations and managed to just barely pull off the maneuver. A maneuver, by the way, that was at the absolute edge of what was physically possible for a ship of the Eisenstein's size. On the Terminus Est, Typhon made damn sure that his bridge crew was trying to do the exact same thing, knowing very well that he would be receiving a fair bout of chastisement if he couldn't kill the Eisenstein. He pushed his ship to the absolute breaking point, and only cancelled the maneuver at the absolute last second, heavily damaging the Terminus Est in the process. However, the Eisenstein did not make it out completely unscathed. Due to Typhus risking the destruction of his own flagship, they managed to get off one last relatively close-range volley, which all but crippled the Eisenstein. And apparently the kinetic energy of the hit sent the bridge crew flying around in all directions, leading to many and severe wounds. Which makes me ask the question, why hasn't anyone in the 31st millennium invented seatbelts yet? I'm just saying, if you're going to engage in a space battle where a hit by enemy weapon fire might send the bridge crew flying in all directions, perhaps it would be a good idea to fasten said bridge crew to their seats. Just an idea for future reference. And of course, the Eisenstein was not quite out of trouble yet. This latest hit meant that the ship would be unable to outrun enemy ships for an extended period of time. And even though the Terminus Est had taken a horrendous beating from their near miss of a literal moon, there were of course other ships in the War Master's fleet, and a few of them had started vectoring towards the Eisenstein. They had picked up a considerable amount of speed slingshotting around the planetoid, but now it was time for them to make good on their escape. That of course meant entering the warp. Unfortunately for the Eisenstein, as previously mentioned, that one hit by the Terminus had severely rattled the ship's astropathic choir. The chief astropath was still alive, although wounded, and his aides were not in a perfect state of mind. The warp at this point in time was tumultuous, to put it mildly. Raging storms would perhaps be a more accurate term, and they were a little bit worried that if they went in, they were never going to be getting out again, and considering how delicious the various densients of the warp consider Psykers to be, that is a pretty good reason to not try. However, Garro knew that this was quite literally do or die, and so he ordered the ship to enter the warp, regardless of the fact that the astropathic choir was wounded at best and slowly going batshit insane at worst, and, to make matters just a tiny bit worse, the Geller field had also been damaged during their escape. The Geller field was up, although not stable. And even at the best of times, the Geller field is a brittle soap bubble that protects the ship against the ravages of the warp. And with the Geller field being unstable, that essentially means that the only protective barrier keeping the ship out of the roiling madness of the warp is popping in and out of existence, which is a remarkably bad thing that can have a whole host of wide, varied, and interesting consequences. But, of course, at least those consequences are unknown. They could be devastating, or they could be harmless, whereas staying in real space would have the unavoidable consequence of having the Eisenstein blown into very small bits as soon as the rest of the War Master's fleet caught up with them. So really, there wasn't a whole lot of choice on offer. Subsequently, Garro chose the one and only option, which was entering the warp. The warp, however, wasted absolutely no time in informing Garro that that was still a rather stupid decision, as it infected the ship with various wonderful monstrosities, mostly of the Nurgle variety, that set about stabbing and pestulating all over everything on the ship, while covering it all in the most awful goop you could imagine. And to make matters even worse, for but the slightest sliver of an instance, Papa Nurgle himself took but the briefest moment of interest in the tiny little ship and its faltering Geller field. He gave it but the gentlest of little touches, and infected the corpses on the bombardment deck, yes, those corpses, the ones filled with the World Eater virus, and decided to make some new and interesting puppets out of them. It would seem that Grulgor had received a new lease on life? Or if not life, then at the very least as the humanized personification of a dumpster fire. Smelly, energetic, disturbing, and downright unlikable. Grulgor and his pals, or what was left of them anyways, rampaged across the Eisenstein's decks, and it became clear that killing Grulgor was going to be somewhat complicated, as he was constantly feeding off the warp to replenish his energies. At this point, Grulgor had essentially become a warp entity, although apparently, and rather interestingly, he still retained corpus mente. In fact, it might even be argued that this was the very reason why he could be reborn in this form in the first place. As we will see later on in some of the Wordbearers novels, skill, determination, or fortitude might not necessarily be the determining factor in who survives a demonification and who doesn't. In fact, good old-fashioned hatred and extremity of emotion might be even more important. And it certainly would not be an exaggeration to say that Grulgor disliked Garro a whole lot. And he was about to dislike Garro a whole lot more, as Garro discovered that he couldn't kill Grulgor with good old-fashioned means like bolt rounds or chainswords. He ordered the ship to leave the warp emergency style. This could be compared to a submarine blowing its ballast tanks and surfacing in an emergency situation, except even more violently. As of course, a submarine's ballast tanks are designed to be vented very quickly. A Imperial vessel is not designed to dump itself out of the warp on a moment's notice. The shock of re-entry will be a rather strenuous thing upon the astropaths, and indeed, that was exactly what happened. To make matters even worse, of course, the Geller fields were failing, and the warp storms were buffeting the ships uncontrollably. The astropaths had absolutely no idea where they would re-enter real space. For all Garro knew, he could be ordering the ship to dump their collective asses directly into a star, or a black hole, or some other unfortunate stellar phenomenon. Luckily for him, the only thing that happened was that he killed off every single last one of his astropaths and caused further devastating damage to the Eisenstein, which, everything considered, was getting off lightly. And of course, as a subsequent consequence of the ship getting dumped back into real space, Grulgor, now having been turned entirely into a warp entity, quickly dissipated into a brownish, gooish, green blob of sludgy nonsense. It's going to be a nightmare to clean up, no doubt, but less of a nightmare than the walking, talking, and fighting version of said greenish-brown goo. But, as the saying goes, out of the fire and into the frying pan. All Garro had really done with this was escape one immediate danger and put himself in another far slower and more excruciating danger. With all of the astropaths dead and the warp engine practically beyond use, the ship was now traveling through real space at the maximum thrust of its engines, which, considering the size of the galaxy, is precisely fuck all. And with no ways of returning to warp space, it would now take thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years for the ship to reach Terra. The mission, it would appear, was well and truly boned. Garro's only real option now was to float aimlessly and hope that someone, somewhere, would find them, which is, again, fucking unlikely. The galaxy is, again, very, very large, and even as heavily populated as the 40k galaxy, relatively speaking, is, there is a hell of a lot more space than there is spaceships. The Eisenstein's odds of being randomly discovered are roughly the same as your chances of winning the lottery 13 times in a row, then marrying and subsequently impregnating a griffin/unicorn hybrid, and then raising the resulting 14 man-horse-bird abominations to adulthood. Something quite clearly had to be done, otherwise this would be the end of this particular endeavor, and Garro was not a person to give up. Even more so now that he had found faith. Oh yes, indeed. He had been spending a bit too much time with a certain prophet lady who had gotten some interesting ideas into his head. Amongst other things, the idea that he was of purpose, and he could not possibly falter here. And so he came up with a rather radical plan. The ship's warp engines would be spun up to maximum capacity, as if they were about to enter into the warp. Then, the entire block of the ship containing the warp engine would be ejected from the light cruiser. This, of course, was a standard emergency means, in case the warp engine's energies could not be fully released, in case of, for example, battle damage or structural integrity problems. The entire warp engine could be shunted out of the ship, and hopefully it would then explode at a safe distance. The hopefully safe distance was the problematic part of this particular plan. As you may remember, the Eisenstein had rather recently played a bout of chasey-chasey, kissy-kissy with the Terminus Est, in which the Terminus had delivered several uncomfortable kisses to the Eisenstein's rear end, including, of course, the larger engine blocks, and he was not at all certain the light cruiser would be able to push itself out of the way of the warp detonation. However, you might be asking, why would this work anyways? Why would you just dump the warp engine? After all, if you dump the warp engine, logically speaking, you can never again re-enter the warp, and that is true. But the engine is specifically designed to rip a hole in the immaterium and allow passage through the warp, which means that it exploding is essentially it releasing all of the energies that would usually be utilized to rip said hole. The theory was that this would generate a massive warp flare within the immaterium, and hopefully somebody would see it, and somebody would come pick them up. Preferably loyalists, if at all possible. The plan was not overly well received by everyone. In fact, one of the Astartes in Garro's command crew that had kind of been teetering on the edge of yes, no, maybe, perhaps, all the while, decided this was the time to make his displeasure known. The apothecary Voyen. This was the very same apothecary Voyen who had been a member of the Warrior Lodge and had been chastised by Garro for this affiliation. He decided to pull a bolt pistol on Garro and threatened to shoot his captain through the head if he went through with this. As far as Voyen was concerned, shunting the warp engine out the back of the ship and watching it go supernova was basically kissing farewell to their last chance of being rescued, rather than their last chance of being rescued. Again, I remind you, without a functioning astropathic choir, the engine in and of itself was utterly worthless, to be fair. And fortuitously for Garro's skull, Voyen decided to not push the issue. The engine was shunted out the back of the ship and detonated. The ensuing explosion was not particularly kind to the already stressed superstructure of the Eisenstein, rendering the already crippled ship even more crippled. Its engines at this point were practically useless, and many life support systems had been stressed to the breaking point. At this point, the Eisenstein was slowly but surely becoming an icy tomb, and taking all of its crew with it. To try and stave off this inevitable demise for as long as possible, all of the crews were gathered in small areas, and most of the life support system was shut off. As now, it was all a battle of attrition, whether or not the icy void would claim them all first, or if rescue, if anybody had even seen the warp flare, would arrive instead. And before we get an answer to that question, we have a little bit of a side note here. So, Garro had become quite the fervent believer of the Saint at this point. His last words upon releasing the engine block was "The Emperor protects," and he had been seen attending services held by the Saint and of course her spokesman, amongst them Kirill Sinderman. And Garro's presence at these sermons had been noted. He had lent an air of legitimacy to this religious movement, and other Astartes had also started attending these sermons. This was rather interesting, because of course it's one thing for mere mortals to be lured by the promise of religion, but for the Astartes it was an entirely different matter. First and foremost, they were not prone to the usual fears of humanity. They did not grow old, and they did not really die either, unless of course brutally murdered in warfare, which was the most usual demise for Elysian Astartes. And then of course there was the fact that they had committed their considerably longer lifespans to fighting for the imperial truth, a secular truth. And here they were, attending sermons for what was quite clearly a budding religion. And with this, I would say that it would not be at all unfair to say that Garro had as large a role to play in building the foundation for this imperial religion as Kirill Sinderman or Euphrati Keeler had. And speaking of religion, every good religion needs a few miracles. And whilst Euphrati Keeler had already been working hard on providing a few of those, they needed something with a little bit more bang. Something truly unlikely. For example, having a ship found in the middle of absolutely nowhere by the precisely correct people they wanted to be found by. Enter Rogal Dorn, and practically the entire Imperial Fist's legion. They had seen the warp flare on their way back to Terra and decided they might as well stop and see what the hell was going on. Not that they either had all that much in the way of choices. According to Sigismund and Dorn, they had just left Horus Lupercal, which at this point is quite the bloody while ago. This is something we heard about in the first book, and apparently they had been immediately beset by various warp storms, and stopped from going any further, until they had seen Garro's signal, and simply decided, well, fuck it, we're pretty much stuck in here, so we might as well try to dump our asses out of the warp near this warp flare, and hope for the best. It was, at the very least, slightly safer than simply just dumping out of the warp blindly. And whilst this might at first seem like the perfect rescue, in reality this was more like leaving the fire plan and actually going down on the dinner plate. Since, of course, now Garro had to figure out some way of convincing Rogal Dorn that Horus had turned traitor. And it's not exactly like Garro had an overwhelming amount of evidence along with him or anything. Not to mention, Dorn was, unsurprisingly, a little bit skeptical as to why the fuck a Death Guard light cruiser was in the middle of nowhere and had just ejected its warp engine block. Not to mention all of the battle damages across the rear quarters of the ship that would appear to come from Imperial lance guns. In other words, Garro now had to convince Rogal Dorn that not only had his brother Horus Lupercal turned traitor, he had fired upon the Death Guard vessel trying to take a warning to Terra, and he had butchered half of his own legion, along with roughly 50% of 2 other legions as well, and was currently embroiled in a bloody battle on the planet of Istvan. He had to convince Rogal Dorn of this rather than the idea that Garro had turned traitor, and tried to do something sneaky-deaky and got shot at by his brethren. Now, granted, of course, Garro did have some standing within his legion, being a captain and a battle captain at that, and he did bring along with him Iacton crews, which hopefully could provide some decent testimony. However, that is still 2 random-ass captains against the supposed honour of a Primarch. Not the best starting point, and indeed, the conversation went about as you would think it would, with Garro getting his pretty little ass beat rather viciously by Rogal Dorn, who was pretty much ready to just kill Garro and assume Horus Lupercal's innocence over the words of some random battle captain. He was far more inclined to simply think that these 2 were lying, rather than assume that a Primarch had turned against the Emperor. And again, I'd point out, at this point in time, the very idea of this happening would be basically impossible as far as loyalists were concerned. Who, then, was it that finally convinced Rogal? Well, Euphrati Keeler, of course, because, you know, Wamensers never did anything good in 40k. Anyways, Euphrati simply just wandered up to the giant angry-as-fuck Primarch, and Rogal Dorn is rather frightening when he's very, very angry. He in fact changes colour, which is quite an interesting little tidbit there, and simply just told him, "No, Rogal, you are being silly. You need to listen to the people here, because they are good people, and I speak with the voice of the Emperor." And for some reason, this convinced Rogal. I swear, if she isn't actually a saint, she has some very effective and sneaky psychic powers. I mean, not only did she convince Rogal Dorn, she also convinced the guards on the Phalanx to simply let her wander into the Primarch's personal sanctum, where he was currently busy beating the shit out of the people they just rescued. Not generally speaking, an area of the ship people would just be free to wander into, and even less so, one has to assume, under those specific circumstances. Granted, to be fair, Rogal Dorn was still not entirely convinced, but at the very least he stopped kicking Garro's ass about a moment before actually killing the poor bastard, and decided he might as well actually check out the validity of these claims. Thusly, he ordered the captains Ephred and Helbrecht to stay with Rogal Dorn with his personal combat detachment aboard the Phalanx. They would head to Terra and the Sol system to deliver this warning to the Emperor, whilst Captain Sigismund would take the rest of the Imperial Fist Legion along with the Navy and return to Istvan, assuming that the system was on hostile hands and try and figure out if Horus had really turned traitor or not. When Sigismund asked what to do if Horus really had turned traitor, Dorn simply stated that he should tell Horus that Brother Rogal will have him answer for it. And as for the adventures of Sigismund and his fleet, well, we'll get to that eventually, in a very, very long time. For now, let's stick with Rogal, Garro, and Iacton, and of course Euphrati and everyone else who is now heading to Terra, where they would receive a less than entirely cordial welcome. The Imperial Fists themselves were long overdue, and here they showed up with just Rogal, 2 companies, and the Phalanx instead of the entire Legion. And then, to make matters far more interesting, Rogal Dorn gets on the Vox and tells Malkador, the Sigillite, that he is carrying a bunch of people that are telling him that Horus has become a traitor. And if he went into more detail, imagine the conversation went something along the lines of this. "Ring-a-ding, hello, this is Malkador. Evening, Rogel here, running a bit late due to shitty weather. Oh, and by the by, I picked up a couple randos on the way who claim that Horus has turned traitor and massacred half his legion in some backwater world by the name of Istvan. Oh, and by the way, they also have a little lady travelling along with them who claims to be a saint, and that she quite frequently hears Dad talk to her and ordering her to cast spells and banish demons and shit. Oh, and of course, where's my manners? How you been doing since Logar broke most of your face? Several seconds of strained silence ensues before finally Malkador responds, "Rogal, have you been drinking again?" But hey, all of that is entirely besides the point. The end result of the conversation is that Malkador decides that Rogel should take his new guests to Luna, rather than straight to the Imperial Palace, stating that the Emperor is busy. And considering what's been going on in his basement as of late, that's probably a bit of an understatement, if anything. Additionally, all of this does sound somewhat far-fetched. First and foremost, a bunch of Astartes, who may or may not be renegades, might not be allowed entrance to the Imperial Palace so easily. In fact, I imagine that Constantine Valdor would pop several blood vessels just even hearing the suggestion of such a thing. Not to mention, they also are bringing with them one battle brother who got stabbed by Grolgor, and is currently suffering from a pestilence that no modern Imperial medical technology can actually cure. Another person you probably don't want to be bringing into the palace. And of course, thirdly, they are bringing along with them a lady who claims to speak with Big E quite frequently and can make demons go away by pointing at them. Yes, all in all, shipping them off to Luna, and more specifically the stronghold of the Sisters of Silence, which, coincidentally, also doubles as a maximum security prison, is a much, much better idea. But hey, at least Malkador has been told, so technically speaking, warning received. And so the fact that Garro and his legionaries were now guests, with limited roaming rights, mind you, of the Sisters of Silence, was a unfortunate inconvenience. And as for Euphrati Keeler and her assorted hanger-ons, well, they were given slightly less of a guest treatment, and were simply just locked away. Garro briefly considered making a point out of this and starting some shit, but this was, after all, the proper Imperium, the Loyalists. It would be rather pointless for him to start fighting them at this point, even if they were dragging his saint away. Besides, Garro wouldn't have to worry about this for too long before he had other things to worry about. Remember that Astartes I told you about a little while ago? The one with the uncurable plague ravaging his body after getting stabbed by Grolgor? Well, his name was Solon Decius, and he had not been infected by a good old-fashioned plague. He had been infected by Nurgle's rot, which at best is... how do I describe this? If a normal disease is made up of bacteria, viruses, other microscopic life forms, Nurgle's rot is that, except it's made up of microscopic demons instead of good old-fashioned bacteria. These things require an absolutely minuscule amount of warp energy, and can essentially feed off the body's soul in a limited extent. As far as good old-fashioned medicine goes, they are literally uncurable, because, well, they're not a good old-fashioned disease, and therefore medicine is rather useless. However, it can be cured through psychic means. We have a couple of examples of this throughout the lore, even in some of the old Warhammer lore, where you basically have the exact same disease quantified and codified by the Sigmarite religion, which explains it as literally demons in the bloodstream that can best be cured through prayer. And considering the fact that poor Solon currently found himself in a non-religious universe, unfortunate for him, prayer was not really an option. However, there was another interesting little entity that had taken pity on poor Solon, left to rot and die in his Medica cradle, forgotten and abandoned by his brothers. Not actually, but that's what the entity told him anyways. And the entity told him that it had taken pity on poor Solon Decius. If his brothers would not help him, if the Imperium and the Emperor would not help him, then this poor, gentle, kind entity would do what they could not and offer him life. All he had to do was say yes. And after months of agonizing pain, of torture unimaginable from a constant ravenous plague, Decius finally said yes. The resultant bug-faced monstrosity that rampaged through the lunar station was definitely not Solon Decius anymore. In fact, considering how easily he tore apart Sisters of Silence by the dozens, and Astartes, he might actually be one of the first demon princes in modern 40k, or, well, 30k history. And interestingly enough, not really Mr. Bugface this, but Garro and the rest of his men were guests, quote-unquote, in the middle of this particular lunar station. They were way down in the bowels of the prison, basically, where they were of course kept for their own protection. And as such, there was no way for Garro or his men to figure out that Solon Decius had turned into a giant fly monstrosity and was currently rampaging across the entire goddamn facility. And that is when Garro heard Euphrati Keeler yelling at him, which is a little bit odd considering she was nowhere nearby, and in all due likelihood in a padded room filled to the absolute brim with psychic dampeners. I'm really wondering what the fuck Euphrati actually is. Because if she is a Psyker, she sure as hell doesn't operate by any of the rules that Psykers normally do have to operate by in 40k. The other option, of course, is that she is actually a saint, but which leads us back to the whole idea of, is she a saint of the Emperor as a deity, the Emperor as a warp entity, la-di-la-di-la. We'll not go into that again now. Anyways, Garro, after having been yelled at, realized that something must have been very wrong and decided to go for a walk. After a short time, he ran into the corpses of many people, whom the fly monster had viciously brutalized on its way, trying to leave the place. Oh, and by the way, the route to the Imperial Palace from this particular vantage point was essentially straight down. Assuming this demon prince of Nurgle can survive the drop, the impact, the fires of re-entry, etc., it might be an interesting infiltration method. And hey, we're talking about what is probably a demon prince of Nurgle here, a little bit of atmospheric re-entry and striking the ground at God only knows how many thousand kilometers per hour shouldn't really be that much of an issue. Unfortunately for Solon, now dubbed the Lord of Flies. That's a bit of a rip-off there, Decius, so perhaps you should feel ashamed of yourself. I think that would probably be appropriate. Anyways, Garro's fought the Lord of Flies, kicking him out of the lunar station onto the lunar's surface, where he survived just fine. Because, well, Demon Prince of Nurgle, would you expect that hard vacuum would kill him or something? Ha! Silly Garro. But in the end, Garro won. It was kind of an, shitty fight, to be entirely honest. Garro is a battle captain, granted, so he has some skills, but for him to take on a freshly formed demon prince, basically, by himself, I feel like maybe that's a little bit above and beyond what we could really expect of Garro. He hasn't really been portrayed as that amazing of a fighter up until now, but fuck it, I guess. So what remains, then, of interest? Well, there's the formation of the Inquisition, basically, with Garro becoming the very first Inquisitor. This was an organization created by Malkador the Sigillite, apparently. And also, rather interestingly, Voyen, yes, that very same Voyen who put a bolt pistol to Garro's head when was he about to shunt the warp engine out the back, and had been a part of the Warrior Lodges, had come to regret his previous actions, and had apparently been reading up on the Lectitio Divinatus himself. He decided to forego his honor as an Astartes, and joined the Apothecarian on Terra to try and find a cure for the contagion that had infected Decius. This is a rather interesting little storyline. I'm wondering if we're going to be seeing anything more around this, because if that holds true, then you've essentially got the exact opposite of Fabius Bile out there somewhere in the galaxy, trying to look for a cure to Nurgle's rot. And considering what was eventually going to happen to his legion, that is a rather interesting little plotline that I'm looking forward to see if we see anything more of throughout the Horus Heresy books. And finally, a note on Euphrati Keeler. she was allowed to meet with Garro one last time before he departed. Apparently, she's not being mistreated all that badly, which is interesting, though she mentioned having been given a moment of respite, suggesting that they weren't being too gentle with her either. I'm wondering again what kind of plans Malcador would have for this woman. Whether or not he would even believe that she would be a saint, if he even accepts the idea of her being a saint, whether or not he rejects it out of hand since he knows the Emperor, etc, etc. I hope we see a little bit more about that, because I'd really like to know what the fuck Euphrati actually is. Especially as she also basically admits to being the one that sent the message to Garro, telling him of the Lord of Flies rampaging throughout the place. And considering I have a hard time thinking the Sisters of Silence would just leave her to her own devices, that would probably mean that she has some way of overcoming the psychic null of the Sisters, which would be interesting to put it mildly. And finally, she herself seems to think that there is some sort of connection between her and Garro specifically, which allows the two to not only communicate, but also allows her to see parts of his future, which would also be rather interesting. She seems to defy all the laws of a Psyker, and yet she's kind of doing the tricks of a Psyker. This is why I like Euphrati Keeler, because there's no really obvious answers with her. Anyways, until the next book in line, that being Book 5, Fulgrim, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.